Hello everyone! Happy whatever day of the week it is that this video gets uploaded, or whichever day of the week down the road you end up watching it when it pops up in your feed. For me, it's a Tuesday, and I mean that literally. I'm not referencing Street Fighter the movie. Alright, but Street Fighter is relevant to today's topic. By the way, my name is Stephanie Bree. Please leave a like on this video, it helps. Subscribe if you haven't, if you're watching this video, please. And leave a nice comment telling me if you agree or disagree with me. But don't just, hey, I kind of like what you said, but I agree, and then keep it short. If you write a paragraph, I'm not likely to ban you, but I will delete it. Keep it short. 3 sentences. 3 more sentences. You get 3 3-sentence paragraphs. That's it. Don't write a book, okay? If you want to write a book, go write a blog, and then send the link to me on Blue Sky. That's acceptable. That's not for the comments section. And the reason why I'm saying that is, by the way, this is going to be a long video. And if you've watched any of my videos before, you know I'm going to be scatterbrained. I'm going to be bouncing around. But I'm asking the question. This is a new series, by the way. There's going to be a bunch of these. I've already got 30 of them on the docket. I'm not going to do them all at once, but I'm probably going to try to do one however often I do a batch of videos. So every time a batch of my videos come out, once a week, once a month, whatever, I will try to do one of these what-if scenarios. And this is just speculation. Nobody can prove me right or wrong. I'm just going to speculate based on what we know and what I believe based on what I know. Today's question is, what if the Sega Genesis 32X, the little mushroom that sits on top of your Genesis / Mega Drive, if you're not an American, and I'm just going to call it Genesis. So if you're not an American, just when I say Genesis, the little babble fish in the back of your brain will turn into Mega Drive in your brain, and you know what I'm talking about. I don't have to say Genesis / Mega Drive, okay? It's the Genesis to me. I'm going to call it the Genesis. I want to get that out of the way because I'm not saying Mega Drive again for the rest of this video, except for where it is probably important. I might just say the Genesis in Japan and leave it there because I know what it was called. We all know that. Let's just get that out of the way, okay? What if the 32X had been a success? Well, we have 3 scenarios that could have legitimately made the 32X a success. But we have to define success in the first place. I'm going to say what would have made the 32X a success is if the machine had garnered enough attention to last long enough to be a viable product that achieved at least a decent software library with a good variety in its availability of software and games, and was financially successful enough, positively profitable for Sega, enough that it wouldn't have led to their eventual downfall, or at least delayed their eventual downfall, potentially. So, we're going to define success as the thing made money and it stuck around longer than it did, and it got more games than it did. But we're not going to just go with the whole, well, if they had done this one thing, boom, it would have sold 10 million copies and had every game I wanted it to have. That's not realistic, and we're not doing that. We're not playing the genie in a bottle game. I rub the genie in and I wish the 32X had been a success, and then boom, whatever I wanted it was. That's not what we're doing here. So we have to lay a few rules. There are 3 potential scenarios in which the 32X could have been what I'm going to classify as a success. And by the way, it's going to be a long video, not a 2-parter, so bear with me. About an hour, but I'll try to keep it under 45 minutes if I can. I'll do my best. So, what we know from real life, the Sega of America and Sega of Japan disagreed on how to enter the 32-bit market. Now, the backstory is Sony was preparing and building up to launch the PlayStation. The 3DO already existed. The Neo Geo was not 32-bit, but it was more powerful than the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. So we know those are actual facts. That's the market that the 32X was released in. So Japan wanted the Saturn, which was hardware they designed based on their Model 2 arcade hardware. Originally based on the Model 1 hardware, arcade hardware, but then they upgraded it to more like the Model 2. It's complicated. Because they wanted to be more 3D capable, because the PlayStation was going to be a 3D focused machine, and that was the direction the market was going in. But before we can really... So that's step 1. We have to define the parameters. What did the 32X... What world did the 32X exist in? You have to understand that to to understand what could have potentially motivated buyers that didn't buy it in real life to have bought it in this imaginary scenario. Also, what could have potentially attracted third-party companies, which third-party companies, which software would they have realistically released on it, and what is a realistic number that it could have sold in hardware units, and how financially viable or profitable could it potentially have been based on what we know in reality, with a little bit of conjecture, because some of this is going to be speculation, because, you know, we don't live in the timeline where it was a success. So the first thing we have to establish is that Sega of America was right, because the Genesis was a success in everywhere but Japan. And so, in real life, Sega of Japan let their egos get the better of them, and they were like, no, we have to make this machine and get rid of the Genesis because it's not selling here, and wham, wham, wham. That's what happened in real life. But we're going to pretend that Sega of Japan was like, you know what? We're making money everywhere but Japan. Let's let America take the lead on this. They know what they're doing. Let them do their 32X. We're going to delay the Saturn. Because you have to remember, we're looking at it with goggles. We know that the PlayStation was a success. But in 1994, when they were gearing up to release the 32X and they were arguing over Saturn and 32X, there was no guarantee the PlayStation was going to be a success. It was an unknown variable. It could have just been another 3DO or another CDI. There was no proof that the PlayStation was going to be a success, so there was no reason for Sony or for Sega to assume it was going to be a success. Therefore, there was no reason for them to take it into consideration when designing their next hardware, because we did know, and they did know, what the specs for the PlayStation were, because they had already been published. We did know what Nintendo was working on at the time, Virtual Boy, and later they were developing Project Reality with Silicon Graphics. And so we kind of had an idea of what that was going to... No, I think it was Silicon Graphics. Anyways, we had an idea of what Nintendo was doing, but we knew their machine wasn't coming out in March of... fall of 1994 in Japan, and fall of 1995 everywhere else. We knew that Project Reality wasn't coming until late 95 at the earliest. So we're talking, this is March 1994. Sega's making plans to release the 32X. So the first assumption we're going to make is the Saturn gets delayed 2 years. So it's not going to... So this is March of 1994. Sega is planning... They're still going to... the Saturn is still going to be a part of this discussion. They're still planning on releasing a machine called the Saturn, we'll assume, at the earliest March of 1996. That's the earliest. So the 32X is going to have 2 years on the market. Now, Sega of America did not see the 32X as a console. And it isn't a console, because it cannot exist on its own. It is not a console. So stop calling it a failed console, because it isn't. It is an add-on, an upgrade to the Genesis. The Genesis was a success. The 32X was the most successful accessory for the Genesis. In that context, the video's over. The 32X actually was a success in real life, but not what people think of as a success. So we're going to play in that sandbox. So now we have the assumption that the Saturn isn't coming out alongside the 32X to divide the market and make people go, I don't know, should I buy a 32X today, or should I wait a couple months and get a Saturn? Because that was stupid of Sega. We know that. We know that from hindsight, but magazines knew that back then when they were questioning it back in the day. So we already knew it was obvious that was a bad decision. Even Sega of America knew it was a bad decision, but they couldn't publicly say that. We knew this from interviews. We know this from interviews that have been done after the fact by the former president of Sega of America, saying, yeah, we knew it was a bad idea, but there was nothing we could do about it. Our hands were tied. So we did what we did. Okay, we know that. So we have to push that aside. Now, we know that the 32-bit or possibly even 64-bit Sega Saturn isn't coming out until earliest March of 1996. Nintendo was shooting for a March of 1996 to release the Project Reality, which later got renamed the Ultra 64, which later got renamed upon release the Nintendo 64. But that didn't actually release until summer in 96 in Japan and fall 96 in the USA and everywhere else that came later. So we do know that Nintendo was having a hard time developing their hardware, and they were having a hard time getting third-party developers on board because of their asinine decision to keep it on cartridges. But we're going to set that aside for a second because that's 2 years down the road. In March of 1994, here's what we know. Sega is going to release the 32X at the end of the year, just in time for the holidays. Now, in real life, Sega was making games for the Genesis, arcades, people forget they were still making arcade games, the Game Gear, they were still making Game Gear games, the Sega CD, they were still making Sega CD games. They were starting to make games for the 32X and starting to make games for the Saturn. So they were on a deadline to rush the games out for the 32X as quickly as they could. And they were on a deadline to also rush games out for the launch of the Saturn as quickly as they could. Because even though it didn't come out until September, well, actually it got released early in May. It was supposed to come out in September of 1995. It released in, I'm just going to say fall of 95. I don't remember if it was October or September or November. But it was in the fall of late 95. Or 94, excuse me. Late 94. The same time the 32X was going to release worldwide. The same month the 32X was coming out, the Saturn was also coming out. Now, the Saturn was exclusive to Japan at the time, but now that we've pushed the Saturn release back 2 years, the 32X is going to have room to breathe. Can't talk. But in 1994, Sega is still developing pretty impressive 3D games for their arcade market. And pretty solid 16-bit games for the Genesis, decent quality 8-bit games for the Game Gear. They're still churning out garbage for the Sega CD. They haven't discontinued it yet. And now the Saturn's on hold. So they'll set aside a team to start doing some preliminary tech demos and things and laying things out to focus on the Saturn, but they've got time to work on the Saturn. They're not on a time crunch. But the 32X does have to come out at the end of the year. So we're gonna the next assumption we're gonna make is the launch of the 32X. Nothing changes. The same games that came out in real life came out in this scenario. No changes to the hardware. No changes to the software. Just what happened in real life happens. Now this is without the shadow of the Saturn looming over us. So now let's talk about your potential market. Who bought the 32X in real life? Genesis owners that wanted to get in on those 32-bit games. Now, what was Nintendo doing? They were doing 32X as well. People forget this. People that don't understand reality don't know that Nintendo also had their own version of the 32X. They just didn't put it in a box and slam it on top of the console. They glued it to the cartridges. It was the Super FX chip, but it's the same thing. It's literally the same thing. The 32X is just a Super FX chip. That's all it is. Except for instead of sticking it inside the cartridge, you just shove it on top of the Genesis. It's the exact same thing. Okay? So, when people say that the Super Nintendo was better than the Genesis and they use actual Super FX games as proof, no, those people are idiots. Those are 32X games. Those games were not better than the 32X. Those games were better than the Genesis, but they're better hardware. Okay? Now, take that out. Base Super Nintendo, no cartridges, no add-ons. Base Genesis, no cartridges, no add-ons, no upgrades, no chips, I mean. Just head-to-head. They were pretty much identical. You know, one had more colors, one had more sounds, one was faster, one had more RAM. That's it. It was just like, yeah, they were comparable. They were, for all intents and purposes, identical. Okay? So let's get that out of the way. Now, the reason why I have to establish that is because that's an actual fact. It's a verifiably proven fact. But, let's set that aside for a second. Why was Sega in a rush to get 3D games on the Genesis? That's the question we have to ask ourselves. Well, because Nintendo was already doing it. They had released Star Fox a year earlier. Well, a few months earlier at this point in the timeline. They had Killer Instinct in arcades, which they were working on a Ultra 64 version that would eventually get scaled down to the Super Nintendo because the Ultra 64 would get delayed, but we're not talking about that yet, but it does come into play. They did have, at this point in time, they were working on Killer Instinct for the arcades. It wasn't out yet, but magazine articles were already coming out about it. We had screenshots. We knew that they were working with Midway and Rare to develop the game, and it was going to run on hardware that was going to be pretty comparable to Sega's 32-bit Model 1 units. So we knew. You have to remember, Sega was an arcade company first. Nintendo wasn't. Nintendo was a home market company first. The handheld had only been out for a couple of years. At this point, it had only been out for a few years. So yeah, it was a big part of their business, but it hadn't become their business yet. We're still a few years away from the handheld taking over the home console and becoming the cornerstone of their business, but that hasn't happened yet. It did happen in reality. Even the Wii sold nothing compared to the DS. You know, the GameCube and N64 combined couldn't sell as well as the Game Boy Advance. So come on, they were a handheld company, but not yet. At this point in time, in March of 1994, Nintendo is still home consoles first. Handhelds are just sort of like, well, but we can put anything on the Game Boy, people will buy it because it's the best option. And Nintendo has pretty much already left the arcade business. Killer Instinct would be their second or third last attempt at an arcade machine. And it was well past the last time they made an arcade machine on their own. Killer Instinct was partnered with Rare and Midway. Cruisin' USA and Killer Instinct 2 would also be partnered with Midway and Rare in the instance of Killer Instinct 2. And I think there was a Cruisin' World that they also partnered with Midway, and then they split. And Nintendo never made an arcade machine again after that on their own. They didn't even make the Mario Kart arcade machine. Namco did. They just gave them permission to do it and put their name on it. So, at this point, Nintendo has conceded the arcade market to Sega. It's theirs. They won. Sega to this day is still the only company legitimately making arcade machines, where everybody else has either left the business or they're just putting mobile games in arcade cabinets. Sega their business is arcades. They started as an arcade business. That's their business. That's what they do. They are an arcade company. They are a coin-operated machine entertainment company. By the way, they also make slot machines and gambling machines and things like that. Those are still technically arcades. They're coin-operated amusement machines. That is Sega's business. Sonic the Hedgehog, Persona, whatever. Those are side projects Sega does because they bring in the money. Their business is arcades. This was still true in 1994. They were happy to have the Genesis on the market, bringing them in money because it was a very financially successful product, because it allowed them to take their arcade games and put them in the home. So once you were no longer willing to drop quarter after quarter after quarter into Afterburner, maybe you're willing to go spend 30, 40, 50 bucks on a cartridge of Afterburner and put it in your living room or your bedroom and play it at home. Smart business for an arcade company. Very smart business for an arcade company. Why? How Nintendo got into video games was because they were a toy company, and Pong was the hot toy at the time. And yes, Nintendo made a Pong machine. That was their entry. Nintendo's entry into video games was Pong. They just made a Pong clone. Alright, so let's get out. Nintendo saw video games as toys. Sega saw video games as their business. Okay? Now later Nintendo would become a video game company. That's not where they were getting there, but they were still doing other stuff besides video games in 1994. Not as much as they had been, but they weren't still just video games. Sega was. Sega always was. They've always only ever been, only ever been an amusement, interactive company. Video game. games. That's their business. It's always been their business. Even when they were mechanical machines that predate what we call video games today, they were still basically what we would think of as video games. Interactive games that you played on kind of like a TV screen, but not really. But that's what they were. They were carnival games. That's what Sega does. So Sega was still prioritizing their arcade business. That's where their focus was. They had set aside teams to make games for the Genesis, and were happy to let third parties get in on it to help them out. And had a strong partnership with Electronic Arts, which is going to come into play in this discussion. But we have to have the facts, because we can't speculate without the facts. So we know that the reason Sega wanted the 32X or Saturn was because they wanted people to take home a cartridge that would allow them to play Virtua Fighter and Virtua Racing. Now, they had already tried the Nintendo way of putting the 32X on a chip, and I'm going to call the Star Fox, Super Mario RPG, Donkey Kong Country, those are 32X games. Those are Nintendo's 32X games. Those are not Super Nintendo games. They are not running on Super Nintendo hardware. They are running on chips inside the cartridge on top of the Super Nintendo hardware, just like the 32X does with the Genesis. It is exactly the same. It's just delivered in a different package. That's it. It's the same. So we're going to only talk about Nintendo's 32X games versus Sega's 32X games. And I'm just going to call them 32X games because they're 32-bit games running on a chip that has the word X in it. Super FX or 32X. The actual chip is the Hitachi SH2, but we don't need to get into semantics. I'm just throwing it out there so you know I know what I'm talking about. Okay. If you look at the actual specs of the Super FX and the Super FX2 chips, combined with the capabilities of the Super Nintendo, they're not that different than the capabilities of the 32X combined with the capabilities of the Sega Genesis. So we have to have a benchmark. So we know Sega already had Virtua Racing in arcades. It was a hit. It was winning awards. People were pouring quarters, and they were taking gallon milk jugs of quarters and then just dumping them into the Virtua Racing machine. Sega made their money in arcades. Because back then, arcades were where the video games made their money. Home consoles existed, but aside from Nintendo, that's not where the money was made. Even Atari didn't make their money on the 2600. They made it on their home computers and their arcade business. It's just that Atari had an unfortunate ending that we don't need to talk about because we have to briefly mention that in 1994, the Jaguar did exist. That will come into play because magazines did compare the Jaguar to the 32X, which, by the way, the Jaguar is not a 64-bit system. It is a 32-bit system that is not more powerful than the 32X. On paper, it might look that way, and I'm not just talking about practical reality. If you set aside polygons per second and theoretical things like that, when you're just looking at actual math, the millions of instructions per second, MIPS, that is horsepower. In terms of computers, the only thing that matters when you're talking about video games is the MIPS. How many millions of instructions per second can your machine process? What you do with those instructions is going to determine what you see on the screen. But if your machine has more MIPS, that machine is more powerful than the machine with fewer MIPS. So that is the bit. We didn't use MIPS back in the day. We were talking about bits. Bits don't matter. Bits are not a measure of horsepower. MIPS are. And when you get into the math, the Atari Jaguar, the Super Nintendo 32X games, the SFX games, Super Mario RPG, Super Mario World 2, Stunt Race FX, Doom, Killer Instinct, etc. By the way, Doom was a Super FX game, so that's going to come into play here. A lot of people forget that, or conveniently ignore that, but it was, and that is important because it actually matters. Now, in fanboy discussions on forums and childhood arguments on the playground, it didn't matter. But for this discussion, it does matter. And I'm going to get into why in a little bit. Because for the companies, it's all about motivation. And for the consumers who are theoretically going to buy these things, it's about motivation. What motivates the companies to put a product out? What motivates consumers to buy that product or not buy that product? And this whole what-if scenario is, what would it take to convince somebody to buy a 32X? And getting rid of the Saturn automatically guarantees the 32X sells better than it did. Automatically. Because anyone who would have waited to buy a Saturn, who was already a Sega fan that was dying to play those arcade games, you know, they were dying to play Panzer Dragoon and Virtua Fighter and Virtua Racing and all those other games, you know, Virtua Cop, etc., etc., they were going to just buy the 32X and not the Saturn, because the Saturn doesn't exist. They have nothing to compare it to. They have no concept of the Saturn. It's just yeah, eventually Sega's going to make a new machine, but right now we have the 32X. And right now, I have money to spend, and right now, I want to play Virtua Fighter, and I don't want to wait for the Saturn to play a maybe better version of it, which it wasn't. Spoilers. But right now, we're gonna fast forward launch of the 32X. We're gonna say it's holiday season 1994. Holiday season 1994. Here's the scenario. Sega wants you to buy a Genesis. They've already brought the price of the Genesis down to $89 US. You can adjust that for inflation on your own. The Super Nintendo was selling for $99 US at the time, just a little bit more. Nintendo was always reluctant to lower their prices. Now, that's not because Nintendo was doing better and sitting comfortably. No, it's because Nintendo's stubborn and doesn't want to lower their prices. Look at the Wii U as proof of that. But at the time, the Genesis was selling better than the Super Nintendo. Not the Super Famicom. In Japan, the Super Famicom, which hardware is the same machine, but it is technically a separate machine. A lot of people combine the Super Famicom and the Super Nintendo into one and say, oh, that worldwide, the Super Nintendo outsold the Genesis. No, it didn't. The Genesis, which only existed in North America, outsold the Super Nintendo worldwide. In every market, it was called Super Nintendo. When you add in the Super Famicom numbers, where, by the way, the Super Famicom did sell better than the Mega Drive in Japan. Yes, I'll acknowledge that. And I'm saying that word I said I didn't want to say, just for clarity's sake, so you understand what I'm talking about. But worldwide, the Genesis sold better than the Super Nintendo. And I'm saying in every market it was called Genesis. It sold better than every market the Super Nintendo was called Super Nintendo. Does that make sense? This is verifiably proven. But there's still Japan. We do have to talk about that. We're going to come back to that. So in 1994, you got your parents gave you a little bit of, you got your babysitting money or your raking leaves or shoveling snow money or you got a part-time job or whatever. 1994, you're a gamer and you want to buy, you've already got a console. Now you've already got either a Super Nintendo or a Genesis. I'm not going to say which one you have. Let's just say you want to buy a new video game, right? Now you have plenty of options. You could upgrade to a new console. You have choices. If you have a Genesis, you have the option of buying a Sega CD. That is still an option in 1994. It was still getting software in 1994. They were still marketing it and promoting it and attempting to keep it alive. It was already on its way out, but they were, when the 32X launched, the Sega CD was still an option, which is why there are Sega CD 32X games. Because Sega was hoping you would buy both. Nobody did, but, you know, whatever. But you could have also took a lateral move and bought a Super Nintendo because they had also upgraded to 32-bit. Now, a lot of people forget that, but a lot of the later Super Nintendo games are 32-bit games. The Super FX chip is a 32-bit well, we're getting into technicality, but we're going to say 32-bit equivalent games. But they're basically 32X games. So, in 1994, you did not have Donkey Kong Country yet. And you did not have Killer Instinct yet. Those would come later. But you did already have Doom. You did already have Star Fox. And I believe you already had Stunt Race FX. And I'm not, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not sure about Rise of the Robots and Balls 3D. I think Rise of the Robots was 32X, and I'm saying 32X, you know what, okay, I'm just going to say 32X from now on, you know what I mean. I've already made it clear. So I believe Rise of the Robots was, there were a lot of 32X games on the Super Nintendo. A lot more than you realize. Probably as many, almost as many as there were actual 32X games on the Genesis. The Genesis 32X. Yeah. So, here's where we have to get into our first round of speculation. Well, there is no Saturn looming over us right now, just like there's no Nintendo 64 looming over us. PlayStation is, though. PlayStation is on the market in Japan, so you do have the option to import a Japanese PlayStation in Christmas of 1994. That is an option. And there are some really good games already on the PlayStation right now in 1994. So, who's buying a 32X? Well, we know in real life it was people that already owned a Genesis. I don't think a single person, not one, and I mean literally, actually, hard number, not one person went out and bought a Genesis to buy a 32X. I think the only people that ever bought a 32X when it was on the market were people that already had a Genesis. I'm going to make that assumption because I think that's pretty well believed by most people, and I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that's the case. I could be wrong, but it's not important. But we're going to assume that at the time, 20-something million Genesis owners were willing to buy, or at least consider a 32X. Now, I'm not going to say that automatically the 32X is going to sell 20 million units and then be done with it. That's stupid. I'm not that dumb. But, in real life, the 32X sold between 1 million to 1.5 million units in that initial Christmas, and another 1.5 million units in the subsequent year, and then it capped out at about 3 million units. That's all it sold in real life. So we have a number. 3 million units worldwide. But the reason why it only sold 3 million units is because people didn't know, should they buy a PlayStation? Should they buy a 3DO? Should they buy a Neo Geo CD because it just came out? Should they buy a Jaguar? Should they buy a PlayStation? Should they wait for the Nintendo 64? Should they keep buying games on the Super Nintendo? Keep buying games on the Genesis? Should they buy a Sega? You know what I'm saying? There were a lot more variables than just what Sony was doing. Sony's one piece of the puzzle, but not the entire puzzle. But they are relevant, but we're going to have to remember that at this point, Sega has decided that they are going to see Sony as 3DO. They're looking at them as the unknown player that's not going to be a competitor. Sony doesn't have an arcade business to fall back on. Well, they've got a business to fall back on. They don't have a presence in arcades. So Sega's not worried about them. Sega makes their money Sega makes their money in arcades. So we're going to assume that they're smart enough to know that that's where the bread and butter is. The home console market is just a vehicle to get arcades in the living room. Just like the Xbox is a vehicle to get PC games in the living room. See where I'm going with this? Yeah, it'll come up. Yeah, that was Microsoft's entire reason for making the Xbox. That was Sega's entire reason for making the SG-1000 in 1983, the same day it came out on the market as the Famicom. Yeah, same day. If you don't know what the SG-1000 is, you're going to have to do your own homework. It's the predecessor to the Master System. That's easy enough. But, let's get back to where we're at. We're going to assume you've already decided that the Jaguar is a piece of shit because that happened in real life, and there's no, we're just going to assume that nothing else changes. We're going to assume that Saturn isn't entering the market, isn't going to change anything else, because the only thing it's going to affect is Sega themselves and some of their third-party partners. Because it's going to take some of their third-party partners away from making games for 32X or 3DO or Jaguar, so they can focus on making games for the Saturn. Because they're gambling on the Saturn because they're, it's a next-generation Sega system, and hey, the Genesis is a success, so let's just give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's get in on this and see where things go. Because again, there was no guarantee that the PlayStation was going to be a success. It was not guaranteed. It was not assumed. In fact, magazine articles were questioning Sony's, if Sony was even going to have if it was just going to be another 3DO CDI situation. Yes, they were actually speculating that. So the gaming market hadn't been sold on PlayStation yet. Remember, it's not out in North America yet. And when we say Genesis, we're talking about North America. So if you're living in the United States, Canada, Mexico, and you have a Genesis and you're thinking about buying PlayStation, well, you have a whole year to wait. Okay, well, you were supposed to have a year to wait for Saturn, but you knew Saturn was coming. You know PlayStation is coming, so that is still going to be a turn. There are still going to be some people that say, you know what? I think I'll just jump into the PlayStation and see where it goes. But we know that people didn't jump into the 3DO or the Neo Geo or the Jaguar or the CDI, but that's because those machines were expensive and didn't have compelling software. PlayStation was reasonably priced for what it was and did have compelling software. So that is a potential motivator. But again, without the Saturn specifically, we could assume that the people that would have bought a Saturn in 1995 instead bought a 32X because they already had the Genesis, and we're going to assume that they're not going to jump ship to the PlayStation because the reason they bought the Saturn is because they wanted those Sega arcade games, which they're not going to get on a PlayStation. They are going to get on a 32X. Now, before you say the 32X could not handle those games, yeah, it could. Obviously, they would be scaled down to the home market, but at that time, remember, before PlayStation came along and made home consoles more powerful than arcades, because it did. It was the first system that entered the market that was actually more powerful than the arcades. Before that, the expectation was you would have to make compromises to make a home console port. Genesis ports of arcade games were not one-to-one comparisons. They were good enough to satisfy the market at the time based on our expectations at the time. You have to look at it based on the expectations at the time. And at that time, there was an expectation that, yeah, the games are going to look like what Virtua Fighter did. Close enough that you're like excited to be able to play a version of Virtua Fighter in the home that is relatively a decent compromised but decent representation of the arcade game. It's not identical, but it's good enough. Same thing with Mortal Kombat 2. People forget that there was no expectation for it to be arcade accurate. They just expected it to be as good as it could be, and the 32X version was better than the Genesis version, and in many ways, not always, but in many ways better than the Super Nintendo version. But that's neither here nor there. So we know if you were in the market for a 32X, it's because you were salivating for those Sega 3D arcade games. So if you bought a 32X, you bought Virtua Fighter. You bought games like Zaxxon's Mother Base 2000. Maybe you bought Afterburner and Space Harrier ports. You probably bought Star Wars Arcade because that was a Sega 3D arcade game. You probably bought Virtua Racing. And there's a high probability you may have bought T-Mech or Shadow Squadron because those were pretty good arcade-style 3D games at the time that were comparable to the expectations at the time. They looked as good, if not better, than Jaguar games. They looked better than Super Nintendo's 32. They looked better than Star Fox, let's put it that way. So the expectation was, yeah, we're going to get Panzer Dragoon. It's not going to have, we know it's not going to have, from real life, it had FMVs, because it was on a CD. It had CD audio, and it had, pre-rendered backgrounds. Okay, the 32X version isn't going to have those things, but the core game is still going to be there. It's going to be running on slightly fewer polygons. Remember, the 32X is a Saturn. The chip in the 32X is the same chip that's in the Saturn. The chips are rearranged, and the board is a little bit different than the Saturn, but the 32X is a Saturn. So anything the Saturn can do, the 32X can do once you remove these CD enhancements. But the 32X can still do those things if you put that game on the Sega CD. 32X combo. Well, we're gonna come back to that. I haven't got to third parties yet because the speculation. The assumption is what games would come to the 32X had it been more successful, right? Well, if there is no Saturn looming over us, more people are going to buy the 32X, which means Sega doesn't have to drop the price as fast as they did, which means they can sell it comfortably at the price point that they were able to make a profit at. And so they're not losing money on the 32X now. In this scenario, every software sold is just more profit. So now more people own the 32X. So we know that from Christmas of 1994 to Christmas of 1995, the 32X sold 3 million units and then it was swept under the rug. Now we know from Christmas of 1994 to Christmas of 1995, The Saturn also sold about 3 million units worldwide. About. Not quite, but close enough that we're just going to round up. So now we have 6 million potential 32X users, because remember, all 3 million of those people that bought a Saturn did so because they wanted those games that they couldn't get on the Genesis. Well, if there is no Saturn, and you can get those games on the Genesis if you just buy a 32X, which is considerably cheaper than buying a PlayStation or a Saturn or anything else. Remember, that was the selling point. It's like, hey, you already have the Genesis. It's only $150, well, $180 at launch. It's only $150 to get a 32X, and now you have virtual reality arcade games in your home. Because we were still calling 3D games virtual reality at the time, which is why Nintendo was calling the machine Project Reality. We weren't calling them 3D games yet. That terminology wouldn't come about until later. Some people were still calling it that, but we were calling them VR games, which is why it's called Virtual Racing, Virtual Fighter, Virtual Cop. You understand? So I'm just going to use the terminology of the day. Virtual reality games sans the VR headsets, because remember, we say today virtual reality, we mean VR headset, but back in the day that was not necessarily the case. And yes, Sega was developing a VR headset for the Genesis. It was going to utilize the Sega CD, and it was being developed in 1994, but we're going to assume they weren't doing that, and that never happened, which wouldn't have been a drain on their resources. And the only reason I'm going to assume that is because we've already established that now Sega's making smart decisions, so we're just going to assume they didn't do that. Okay, so now it's Christmas season, 1995. Now we've had a whole year of selling 6 million 32X consoles. During that time span, in real life, there were a lot of games in development for the 32X that were announced that eventually would get migrated elsewhere or canceled entirely. We have magazine articles that can, and Wikipedia articles that reference those magazines to have an idea of what games could have or should have or would have been on the 32X. But I'm still going to assume some of those games didn't come to the 32X anyways because of reasons I'm going to get into. I'm going to start with what we know. We know Sega's arcade games that they rushed to get out, and their Saturn games that they rushed to get out at launch of the Saturn would have come out on the 32X. We know that because there was no Saturn to put them on. And those games were in development for the 32X before they were moved to the Saturn. So we can assume Virtua Fighter 2, Fighting Vipers, Panzer Dragoon, Virtua Cop, Clockwork Knight 1 and 2, Bug 1 and 2. We can assume those games were and Sega sports games, which I'm not going to list, but I'm going to just say Sega sports games, were all going to get released over the next year or two on the 32X. So over the span of 1995, any game that would have been on the Saturn, remember those games were being developed for the Saturn to launch the same day in Japan as they were launching on 32X in the USA. So we know those games would have been probably launch or relatively close launch window or post-launch games for the 32X. So we know that Panzer Dragoon would have been on the 32X. We know that Virtua Fighter and Virtua Racing and Virtua Cop and all those games would have been on the 32X. We know that. That's not an assumption, we know that. Because they were developing them for the 32X in real life. They just prioritized getting the Saturn versions out first. Because they needed the Saturn. Okay, but now that they don't, and we're not going to talk about speculating what games would have come to the Saturn because it's launching in March of 1996 to compete with the Nintendo 64. The assumption is PlayStation's not even a factor. By then, PlayStation will be in the history books like the 3DO and the CDI before it. That's the assumption everybody's operating on. Just because it has the games and looks good and it's priced reasonable doesn't guarantee it's going to sell well. Other systems that had those same things going for them, ColecoVision, Intellivision, etc., didn't sell well. So just, that's not enough. You got to entice the gamers. But you have to look at the market. The Sega gamers wanted those arcade machines. They were going to come to the 32X. So that was going to keep them on the 32X, which means it would have at least doubled its life-to-date sales. 6 million units is nothing to sneeze at. That is a viable system you can actually put software on. So now we have a user base that's going to, and the rising tide is going to raise all boats. So every software unit that's sold on the 32X, we can double it. So every game that's sold on the 32X, now that it's doubled, some of those third-party companies are going to take a second look at the 32X because, hey, actually that game sold well enough. And it's relatively cheap to develop for compared to the Saturn, which doesn't exist, and the PlayStation, which, well, yeah, it's got the hardware, but compared to making games for the arcade or making games for the theoretical Saturn that doesn't exist, yeah, PlayStation is cheap. But compared to making games for the PC, well, it's cheaper to make games for the 32X. Because you're just taking the Genesis as the foundation and scaling up. That's not hard to do because you're already doing that on the Super Nintendo with their version of the 32X, the SFX chip. So you're already doing that. By the way, Nintendo wasn't the SFX chip isn't the only chip that enhanced the Super Nintendo's capabilities. So I'll have to do a whole video on that one of these days. Now, we have a baseline, right? We've laid the foundation. We've gotten... Now, would the 32X have continued to be a success? Well, at this point, it's already a success financially for Sega. So we can speculate a few things. Going forward, it's going to continue to get software for another year or two. And I'm going to say that they're still going to launch the Saturn in 96 alongside the N64, but I'm going to assume it gets delayed to September, just like the N64 did, because they're going to buy themselves that time. Because if Nintendo's delaying, well, then we're going to delay too. And now, basically, you're just going to get the Dreamcast. So instead, there never was a Saturn in this scenario. You're going to get the Dreamcast in a world where Sega has money. They're not broke. And they've got the resources to develop games for it. And we're still going to assume the PlayStation was a runaway success. Okay? We're still going to assume that. We're not even going to we're just going to make that assumption. But now you have a Genesis that sold, let's say, 40 million units instead of 30. You have a 32X that sold, let's say, 9 million units instead of 3. And Sega now has money in the bank instead of being broke. Because remember, they stopped selling the Saturn because selling the Saturn, they had to sell it at a loss, and they weren't selling enough games to make up the loss. They were losing money. They didn't want to sell the Saturn. They wanted to stop selling the Saturn to stop losing money so they could take what money they had left and throw a Hail Mary at the Dreamcast. While hoping their arcade business didn't sink, which it didn't because it's still operable and viable today. So, they didn't die. They just discontinued making a product that was no longer viable for them and focused on their core business I've already established was always their core business and it still is to this day. By the way, look at Sega's profits and their just Google Sega net worth and you'll know that they're a viable fucking company. They're a pretty big company today because they make arcade machines and gambling machines. Not because they make Sonic is a big part of their business, but it's not their entire business. It looks like it's their entire business if you only look at one piece of the pie. The pie looks like this. Here's the pie. This right here. This right here, I'm going to put my finger in it. This piece of the pie is Sonic and Persona and their video games. This piece of the pie is their arcade business, okay? Sega's an arcade company, and they still were in the 90s. Now, IRL, PlayStation and Saturn and N64 did make home consoles more powerful than arcades, and people were no longer impressed by arcades. The arcade business went through a decline. It's seen a resurgence in recent years, but it went on a big decline. And it's even the resurgence it's seeing today is nothing compared to what it was back then. Okay, I want to make that clear. You could not go anywhere. If you went to Walmart, they had arcades. Kmart had arcades. Your laundromat had arcades. Your movie theater, your bowling alley. your dine-in restaurants, not just your Chuck E. Cheese, but anywhere you went, there was an arcade machine somewhere. That's what it was like in the heyday of arcades, not just dedicated spaces for arcades, okay? So, even today, arcades are nothing what they were compared to in their heyday. But, the heyday was still happening in the early 90s. So now we're going to say the 32X was a success. We're going to go back. We're going to backtrack. I said I'm going to bounce around. And we're going to talk about potential software that could have, in addition to what I've already established, could have, theoretically, been released on the 32X and what impact that would have had on the industry as a whole. Because the whole point of these speculations, this thought exercise, especially for fans, is the what if, to dream, imagine what games could have been on the 32X. And what could they have looked like, and how awesome would that have been had they been on it. That's the purpose of this speculation. So within that context, I am going to go back, but I'm going to go into the future. 1996, it's September, Sony just started really ramping up PlayStation, right? They're on a roll. Remember, Final Fantasy VII isn't out yet, but it's coming. It's already coming, and everything else that happened with PlayStation is still going to happen. So here's September 1996. Sony's riding the high of the PlayStation. They're still climbing the hill, but they're already on the hill. They're on the upward swing. N64 just came out. And I'm going to say the same weekend, the Dreamcast comes out. Now, I'm going to call it the Saturn, but it's the Dreamcast. That's literally what it is. It's a 64-bit system. Yes, the Dreamcast was a 64-bit system. It's the Dreamcast. It's everything. It's the Dreamcast, not the Saturn. The Saturn never happened because the 32X was the Saturn. You know what I'm saying? In this scenario, that's what happened. But what is the ongoing outcome of Sega and the rest of the gaming industry? Nintendo is still going to stick to cartridges, so nothing is going to change on the N64. Everything that happened on the N64 is going to be the same because they're still competing with the same systems. They're competing with the PlayStation. Saturn was never a competitor because by the time the N64 came out, Sega was already gearing up to discontinue the Saturn because it would only be discontinued 1 year later. And 1 year after that, the Dreamcast came out. N64 never competed with the Saturn. The Saturn was already dead the day the N64 came out. PlayStation killed it with the help of Sega's idiocracy. But Nintendo is still competing with PlayStation, and that's gonna go the same as it did. So no changes there. 102 million PlayStations, 29 to 34 million N64s, depending on which source you reference. But now we have a Dreamcast, right? It's sitting there side by side. It's more powerful than the PlayStation. It's more powerful than the N64. Now, I'm going to assume that this is the machine they released in 1996 because it's comparable to the hardware they already had in the arcades. And so this is going to give them the opportunity to bring those arcade machines home. And that's why I'm going to assume that it is just the Dreamcast, okay? Because that's what they were already working on in 1996 when they were throwing away their money trying to keep the Saturn alive. They were already back behind closed doors developing the Dreamcast. I know there's the whole Katana situation, but we're just going to sweep that under the rug and pretend like it never happened. So now you have a 64-bit Dreamcast with a CD-ROM, a 64-bit Nintendo 64 with a cartridge, and a 32-bit PlayStation with a CD-ROM. Now, the Dreamcast games obviously are going to look better than the PlayStation, but the PlayStation games still look good enough. The PlayStation is still comparably priced, and Final Fantasy VII is still going to come out and change the world and sell a bajillion copies and then make PlayStation a household name. That's still going to happen because those dominoes have already been knocked over and they're all falling. Those dominoes are already falling. But we could go into the Dreamcast with a few additional assumptions. Assumption number one, Sega is solvent. They now have money in the bank. They didn't lose money on the... They lost some money on the CDX and the Game Gear and the Sega CD. That still happened. That doesn't change. That doesn't change. But as a whole, the company is financially viable because the arcade is doing well, the Genesis plus 32X is doing well. They still swept the Sega CD under the rug because it never did. It was nothing could save the Sega CD. I'll do a speculation video on how they could have saved the Sega CD, but it's not going to be as long as this one because, spoiler alert, there's nothing that could have saved the Sega CD. Without having the outcome that Sega had anyways, as in going broke and exiting the hardware business, because they would have just thrown everything into the Sega CD and still gone broke. So, yeah, there, I don't have to do the video. I'll still do the video, but I'll give my reasons why. But, I told you this is going to be a long video, and we've already gone past the 45-minute mark, so now we're shooting for an hour and a half, because I still got more to say, because there's still 2 more scenarios that I'll breeze through quicker, because they're not going to be as in-depth as this, because I've already laid the groundwork. So all we have to do is just make modifications and then just make the necessary assumptions that we've already made. Since the 32X was successful enough to garner a little bit of a better install base, more software sales, and probably more software library, that means there were more companies willing to make games for the 32X. Probably the same companies that were already making games for the Genesis anyways, especially companies that had arcade games that they could bring to the 32X that would have been appealing to the market that was buying the 32X in the first place because they wanted Sega's arcade games. They weren't necessarily... Some of them were probably wanting a Sonic game, and we're going to come back to that because there is a potential Sonic game, I know it is at Sonic X, that could have landed on the 32X. Not been a system seller, but been more impressive than what you think. And that would have had a domino of getting other games on the 32X. And I have a good argument for which games would and would not have come to the 32X. And I'll make my case when I get there. This is not going to be a 2-part video. I'm just going to make it a long video. So please bear with me. You can pause and come back to it if you need it to be a 2-parter. Spoilers, you can always do that. You don't have to watch the whole video in one sitting. So I hope that you're smart enough to know to do that. I should have said that in the intro. Anyways. Please be kind to me in the comments. Okay. So now the Dreamcast did launch with pretty strong sales initially. It did. We're going back to IRL. It did launch with pretty good third-party partnerships, but there were a lot of companies that were skeptical of putting games on the Dreamcast because the Saturn 32X debacle and Sega CD had shaken their faith in Sega. Which is why EA did not make games for the Dreamcast. So, we're going to assume that EA did make games for the 32X because they were already making games for the Genesis. They did make games for the 32X. Now we're going to assume that they just made more. Basically the standard fare. And now those games are on the Dreamcast. So now you at least have stronger third-party support on the Dreamcast. So the Dreamcast already sold well IRL, so we're going to assume that it sells just as well. But it comes out 2 years earlier. 1996 to 2000 is 4 years. That's 4 years for Sega to sell the Dreamcast instead of a year and a half before the PlayStation cuts its throat, or PS2 cuts its throat. Okay? And Sega was already on the ground bleeding because of the ass kicking that they gave themselves, banging their head against a brick wall when they released the 32X alongside the Saturn. But since that doesn't happen in this imaginary scenario, now they've got money behind the Dreamcast. They've still got impressive arcade games that they can bring to the Dreamcast. And you're going to have a Dreamcast that sells closer to 25-30 million units worldwide instead of between 9 to 10 million depending on who you ask. Okay, so now Sony's ran its course. They're gearing up to release the PS2. No changes there. Nintendo has ran its course. They're gearing up to release the GameCube. No changes there. We can assume that Sega's next console is going to be nothing more than the Xbox. And going forward, that's all it's going to be, is just replace Sega with Microsoft. Or replace Microsoft with Sega. Whatever Microsoft did, that's what Sega did. So, the Xbox, that's the Sega Xbox. The 360, that's the Sega 360. And everything else plays out exactly the same. The only difference is Microsoft never gets into the business because they don't feel threatened, because the market's crowded, and the 3 players that are in it are doing well, and there's no room for Microsoft to get involved. So they just throw everything at Steam and Windows, and they're doing fine anyways. They would be doing better without the Xbox as a company today if they never got into that business. So, you know, and then there you are. Everything up to today would just be Xbox, would just be Sega, and we can. That's a safe assumption because every game that comes out on Xbox is just a game that would have been on Sega anyways, because Microsoft partnered with Sega on the Dreamcast, tried to buy Sega to launch the Xbox. Sega put a lot of games on Xbox consoles, and they just wouldn't have put them on PlayStation and Nintendo. They just would have kept making them for themselves, and they would have remained financially viable. Now, that's a unfair assumption, but we're just going to make that assumption and leave it there. That's scenario A. In scenario A, if they had just never made the Saturn, delayed it till 96, and then just released the Dreamcast 2 years early, and just focused on the Genesis and 32X, which was already profitable at the time, and let it continue being profitable, they wouldn't have lost all that money. They wouldn't have had to discontinue the Dreamcast because they could. They discontinued the Dreamcast because they couldn't afford it. Even if it was selling well, they still couldn't afford it because they already lost too much money. It was making profit per unit per software sale, but it wasn't making profit for the company because the hole they were in was too big. They couldn't get out of that hole. So if we take away that hole and make the Dreamcast profitable, Sega's still profitable. They have no reason to get out of the business if they're doing well. Now, scenario B is going to be easier. Scenario B is going to basically be, and I'm going to come back to software in a minute. Scenario B is going to be basically, they don't do the 32X, they just do the Neptune instead. There is no 32X, they just do the Neptune. And I'm going to also make the assumption that there is no Saturn. They just released the Neptune, which is the 32X, but it's got the Genesis built in, and it's one system. That's their next-gen system, and then that plays out the same as the Saturn versus the PlayStation. Even though they didn't have, you know, because the hardware would have still been comparable to the PlayStation. It just would have been on cartridges. So it would have probably looked more like the Jaguar, but slightly better in some respects, but not really. But it would have had a better opportunity to sell because it would have been reasonably priced, but it wouldn't have been able to sell to existing Genesis owners because you would have had to buy a separate machine. So we're running into a whole bunch of messy situations where all I'm going to say is it ends up just playing out as it did in real life, only it's the Neptune instead of the Saturn, and there never was a 32X. In that scenario, the 32X is not successful. It still sinks them, and the Dreamcast still fails, and then they exit the market, and then everything goes on as it did in real life. It's just we had the Neptune instead of the Saturn. So all those people that saying if they had just released the Neptune instead, well, instead of the Saturn, it wouldn't have changed anything. Alongside the Saturn, things would have been worse. They wouldn't have even got to the Dreamcast if they had released the Neptune 32X and Saturn all at the same time. They wouldn't have even made it to Dreamcast. They would have gone out of business entirely had they done that. Because then they're not selling anything. Then they're just throwing away their money on a sinking ship, which they were already doing. But it was a sinking ship with a hose over the side, and they had a pump pumping out the water. This is a sinking ship where there's a hole in the hose. That wouldn't have worked. Scenario C is everything plays out exactly as it did in real life. Everything. But Sega decides to kill the Genesis early, but because they did that. They killed the Genesis early to focus on Saturn. But instead, they decide to focus on saving the 32X and just letting the Saturn do its thing. So any game that comes out on Saturn is also going to come out on 32X because Sega really believes in the 32X. And the Saturn is just there because they assume Sony's not a threat. So they're focused on 32X, but the Saturn still exists. They're still going to end up in the same scenario. You just get a few more games on the 32X, but Sega still is a sinking ship. I'm not going to do the fourth scenario, which is what if the 32X never existed at all. and they just focused everything on Saturn. That's a separate video. That's an entirely different set of circumstances. Now, for the fun part. The games! Come on, please keep watching. You can come back to it later, but this is where I get to the games. Okay, now we're at the... This will be easy, but it's still gonna be... I'm still gonna make my case. I'm not gonna just say this game, this game, this game, and then just leave it at that. I'm gonna start with Vector Man. Would Vector Man have been released on the 32X, and would it have made a difference? So, why did Vector Man exist? Well, we knew in 1995, Nintendo was working on a game called Donkey Kong Country with Rare. And it was going to run on the Super FX chip, which means it was going to be a 32X equivalent game. Which is why it looks better than Vector Man, because Vector Man's running on the native Genesis, unaided, unassisted. Donkey Kong Country is not running on Super Nintendo hardware. It's running on enhanced hardware with a Super FX chip in it. That's why it has those impressive graphics. So, Sega wanted a game that would look like Donkey Kong Country, and they came up with Vector Man. Now, the Genesis does not have the color palette to do that. And without the aid of the 3D graphics chip to give it the better looking 3D graphics, it's not going to look the same. Now we get into Vector Man. Sega didn't put Vector Man initially on the 32X because they were... The Genesis was already successful. The Genesis had an install base. They didn't want to invest the resources in developing Vector Man on the 32X because Sega's policy was to make games for the 32X, not the Genesis. They did not take games that were already... Sega did not take games that were already on the Genesis, except for one, and put them on the 32X. They never did that. Every game Sega made for the 32X was exclusive to the 32X in this context, as in it did not have a Genesis or Mega Drive counterpart. The one exception being Virtua Racing, which came out a year earlier using the Nintendo method, put the chip in the cartridge. The game was too expensive because of that, didn't sell, didn't really run well, didn't look good, so they scrapped it and then just did the 32X version. As hey, this is what you wanted, right? But they didn't do that with Vector Man because they needed Vector Man on the Genesis to keep the Genesis competing with Super Nintendo. If they didn't put Vector Man on Genesis in IRL, but they put it on the 32X instead, it would have had more colors and it would have looked better than Donkey Kong Country because it had better capabilities. But it still wouldn't have been a system seller because it's not a good game. I'm going to be honest. Donkey Kong Country is the better game. It doesn't matter about graphics. Graphics don't mean shit if the gameplay's not there. It's just another run and gun. There's already 100 run and guns on the Genesis. What makes this one special? Nothing. The graphics, that's it. That's what made it special. And, well, I'd rather play Donkey Kong Country. And I'm saying that as a Sega fan. I was also a Nintendo fan at the same time. Yes, I had both consoles. Because I love Nintendo too, by the way. I just don't give them credit for things that they don't deserve. And I'm a practical person. I don't overstate the reality. I don't just say, Super Nintendo was better, and then point to games that aren't Super Nintendo games running on the Super Nintendo. If it has an enhancement chip in it, it's not a Super Nintendo game. It's an enhancement chip game. Running on the Super Nintendo. Okay? That's the actual verifiable, undeniable proof in fact. That's just a literal fact that cannot be debated. Now, in 1995, 1996, 1994, we didn't give a shit. It was just, hey, this game's on the Super Nintendo and it looks good. They didn't always let us know which games had the SFX chip in them. The magazines did. Sometimes the packaging did. Sometimes it didn't. But it wasn't... Who cares? It doesn't matter. It's running on the Super Nintendo I already own. So it looks good. That's all that matters. But For this context, it does matter because it matters to companies deciding where they're going to put their games and what those games are going to look like. So in the scenario A, there is no Saturn looming, so Sega knows that the 32X is their next gen system. They're going to ride it until they can get the Dreamcast out, or well, I'm calling it Dreamcast, but it could have been Saturn. We don't know. We're just going to say whatever system they released in '96. Okay, but since that's not coming out for 2 years, I've already laid out the groundwork. Vector Man would have still been a Genesis game. That game wasn't going to get released on 32X. Sega needed that game on the Genesis. They needed it on the Genesis. They already had Virtua Racing and Virtua Fighter to sell you on the 32X, and Star Wars Arcade and a few others, and that was working, so why rock the boat? So I don't think Vector Man nor Vector Man 2 would have come out on the 32X. Those would have still been Genesis games. But I do think Sonic 3D Blast would have been a 32X game, not a Genesis game, and since there's no Saturn, then there would have been a Saturn game. The only thing we can say about that is it would have looked like the Saturn version minus the FMVs and the CD quality audio. So, that's it. It would have looked better, but with nothing to compare it to. The reason why the Genesis game gets shit on is because there is a Saturn game to compare it to. The game doesn't look good on the Saturn, but the Saturn version looks good enough, or better than the Genesis version enough, and people have seen it with their own eyes, that the Genesis version looks like ass in comparison to the Saturn version. But if there was no Genesis version, there is no Saturn version, there's only a 32X version that actually looks good, the game would have sold better than it did. But I'm not going to be, it sold 10 million units. No, whatever it sold on Genesis, plus whatever it sold on Saturn, that's what it did on 32X. Well enough to keep Sega solvent, but not well enough to be a system seller or a big hit on the 32X. Not a big hit. Sega doesn't need that though. Sega's bringing their arcade games. So now I've already given you Sega's games that would have been on the 32X. Basically anything they put on Saturn just would have been on 32X. There you go. That's easy. That's easy to speculate. Which does bring the 32X library into a lot more healthy territory. A lot better than what it got originally. Except for Panzer Dragoon Saga. I think that game would have been a launch title for what we'll just say Dreamcast, because I've been saying that in this scenario. And it would have been looked better than it did, probably sold better, and would have, been a good, awesome thing to have. Because if you follow the timeline, by the time that game was developed and ready to release, in this scenario, the Dreamcast is out, so yeah, it would have been a launch title. So there you go. That would have also helped the Dreamcast. So, you're welcome, Sega fans. Okay, well, imaginary Sega fans that don't exist in this hypothetical scenario. But still, you're welcome. But you're still going to get Panzer Dragoon and Panzer Dragoon 2. I'm going to call it 2 because I don't know how to say that word that it uses for a subtitle. And any other game that Sega released on the Saturn is going to get released on the 32X. But now we're going to get into speculative territory. There were a lot of games that were developed side by side for the PlayStation and the Saturn that first year and a half that the Saturn was on the market, and then things started to fall off. Now, the assumption is those games would have been on 32X as well, but not so fast. Some of those games were only on the Saturn, but never on the 32X, because the Saturn, with its CD-ROM capabilities, and still having 32X as its core, would have been comparable to the PlayStation. Resident Evil would not run on the 32X, and Capcom, who was not a friendly partner to Sega, they threw them a couple of bones and then walked away, would have had no reason to chop the game up and scale it down for the 32X. And I know what you're going to say, but they did RE2 for the N64. Yeah, because the N64 was a financially successful system, and Capcom had a rocky relationship with Nintendo, but it was a better relationship than they had with Sega, so they were motivated to do that. There's no motivation for Capcom to do that, so there's no Resident Evil on the 32X. And I'm not going to get into it, but there's no Tomb Raider on the 32X. Simply put, it couldn't run it. It could run the polygons, but it couldn't run the game, because that game depends on its FMVs and its pre-rendered backgrounds, and those are things the 32X cannot do without the assistance of the Sega CD, which, I'm just going to say, we got 5 games on the 32X that were compatible with this, or on the Sega CD that were compatible with the 32X. I don't think we were going to get very many more, and they're not going to make a difference. They're not going to move the needle one way or the other. the Sega CD still fails, still gets swept under the rug. So I'm not even going to speculate what 32X CD games would have been in this scenario. I'm just going to say it doubles. So there's now 10 instead of 5. Who cares? It doesn't move the needle one way or the other. You're not getting Metal Gear Solid on the 32X CD. That's not happening. You're talking about a $600 console, or a $600 investment at that point, to buy a Genesis and a 32X and a Sega CD just to play one game. Nobody did that. You think it's hard enough to get people to buy a Genesis and a 32X? Try getting them to buy those two things and a Sega CD. People weren't even buying the Sega CD on its own. Well, when it was paired with the Genesis. So no, that's not going to happen. So let's squash that bug. You're not going to get Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. So basically any game that was made for PlayStation that had a Saturn equivalent, those games aren't coming to the 32X. None of them. What you're going to get are sports games that EA put on every system. Some of them were already on 32X, some of them weren't, but we're just going to assume that any game that EA made for the Saturn, or any game that EA made for the PlayStation, or any game that EA made for the N64, well, not the N64 because they were, yeah, maybe that first year they would have kept making games for this 32X before they moved on, because there's always that 1 year transition period from last gen to next gen. So one more year. So yeah, okay. So you're going to get EA Sports games, and that's about it. Square is not going to make Final Fantasy for the Saturn, for the 32X. That's still going to PlayStation. Every game that they made for the Super Nintendo stays on Super Nintendo. None of those are coming to 32X. Arcade games. Well, Midway was still competing with Sega in the arcades, but they had tremendous success on the Genesis, and they did, you know, by way of acclaim, let Mortal Kombat 2, or at least get Mortal Kombat 2 on the 32X. So it's safe to assume that Mortal Kombat 3 and also Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 would have also got 32X ports. That's a safe assumption because the Saturn did as well, so did the Super Nintendo. That's a safe assumption. It already got Primal Rage in real life. It's not getting Killer Instinct because that's a Nintendo property that they partnered with Midway and Rare to do in the arcade and kept it on the Super Nintendo, so that's not coming to the 32X. Now we have Konami. Konami barely bothered with the Genesis. Again, they barely bothered with the Saturn. I'm going to assume that they didn't even touch the 32X, just like in real life. Even in this scenario where it sold better, they're still hedging their bet. They're still betting on Saturn because it's cheaper to make games for. It's going to give them the resources to make the games they want to make, and there's no justifiable reason for them to scale down their games for the 32X, because remember, it's a cartridge-based system. Just because it's selling well doesn't mean shit. So I don't think Capcom releases, or Konami, excuse me, releases anything on the 32X. Nothing at all. Not even Symphony of the Night wouldn't run on the 32X. And they're not going to bother putting it on the... I've already talked about the CD attachment. Alright. That also means Capcom's not putting Street Fighter games on the 32X, and that's because they only put 2 on the Genesis anyways, and we're already focusing on Super Nintendo and PlayStation, and they put a whole bunch of them on PlayStation that didn't get released on Saturn. Some of them got released on Saturn, but that's again because it had the CD-ROM. And again, Capcom's not going to bother putting games on Sega CD-ROM 32X, because that's a mouthful, and that's an investment. And Capcom plays it safe, always have. So they're not going to... They did put one game on the 3DO, but that had the backing of Trip Hawkins, founder of EA, and EA was making games for us. So even though 3DO, we know, in hindsight, sold like ass, we didn't know it was going to sell like ass back in the day. The magazines did, but the people didn't. Because people still wanted a 3DO. I wanted a 3DO. But no one could afford it, which is why they did buy PlayStation, because it's basically a 3DO, but you can afford it. That's why people that wanted a 3DO bought a PlayStation. Myself included. That's why I bought a PlayStation. Yes, I had a PlayStation and a Nintendo 64. Didn't bother with the Saturn. But I did have a 32X, so there you go. But, alright. Okay. So Konami, EA, the usual suspects aren't putting games on the 32X, but we are going to get the Saturn's Sega games on the 32X, but they're going to be modified to fit the specs of the system. And you're going to see some Electronic Arts sports games, but they're not going to be the PlayStation versions. They're going to be the Genesis versions with prettier colors. That's it. That's literally it. Because they were still making those games for the Genesis side by side. And I can see EA doing that. If the 32X has a decent enough install base and they're making money on it, why not? EA puts their games on everything if they can make a buck. So there's no reason why they wouldn't also make those games for 32X if it had been successful enough to justify it, which this is the scenario I laid out where it would have been. Now, I'm not going to go line by line every game. I'm just going to say that any other games that would have or could have come to the 32X are purely speculation at this point. But I'm going to assume, aside from Sega's Saturn games on the 32X and EA's games that didn't come to the 32X coming to the 32X, and the aforementioned Sonic 3D Blast, that's it. All of that will be your theoretical 32X software library. That's it. Nothing else is going to come to it. And I'm not going to get into the reasons why. The reason is PlayStation. That's it. The reason is everybody was focused on PlayStation. Everybody else was comfortable with Genesis or Super Nintendo. There was no, even though the 32X is doing okay, there's just no reason for them to bother with it because they didn't bother with the Saturn anyways. And any game that would have been on the Saturn and PlayStation at the same time wouldn't have worked on the 32X because of the cartridge limitations. And I've already canceled out or negated the CD. I've already negated the CD as an option, so there you go. Arcade companies, well, that was it. Konami, at the time, it was Sega, Midway, Konami, Capcom. So you get a couple more Midway games, and that's it. You might have got NFL Blitz, but I highly doubt it because Blitz came out later and probably would have gotten released on as a launch title for the Dreamcast. With Blitz, I don't think Blitz was released for the Saturn anyway, so I'm going to make that assumption. Blitz came out after the 32X would have been viable anyways, and it probably wouldn't have run on the hardware, so you're not going to get Blitz. So that's it. That's all you're going to get. That's your software library. 2 more Mortal Kombats, some EA Sports games, and every game that Sega released on the Saturn that could work on the 32X on the 32X. Minus Panzer Dragoon Saga, because that's going to be a launch title for we'll just say the Dreamcast in this timeline. And that's the video. Thanks for watching.